Hello, everybody, and assalamu alaikum. It's absolutely wonderful to be with you all today and to talk about something I'm absolutely passionate about, and that's journalism. But first of all, I'd like to say that it's been an absolute pleasure to support the Young Muslim Writers Awards over the years and working with the organizers as a judge and as a speaker at one of their awards ceremonies. It was also a great pleasure to read the submissions, and it's always very difficult, as you can imagine, to make a decision about a winner when such high quality work is being submitted. And I'm very pleased that the competition has now launched in my home country of France as well. First of all, allow me to say a few words about this award and the incredible charity that supports it. The Young Muslim Writers Award is a project that is delivered by the charity that is an international NGO based in the UK called Muslim Hands. Muslim Hands works in over 50 countries, and it does an incredible work delivering projects that generate income in a sustainable way, helping people in great difficulty. It also delivers education and also emergency relief for the most needy in all those countries. The Young Muslim Writers Awards competition is now in its 10th year, so huge congratulations. And it hosts regular writing workshops and an annual writing competition for children aged between 5 and 16. And writers can actually submit their work to the following categories: short story, poetry, journalism, screenplay, and play script. The 2020 competition is now open, and it closes on the 13th of August. So don't miss the deadline. I would strongly encourage you to submit an entry in one of those categories or many of them. You will find more information on the website ymwa.org.uk. Now let me introduce myself briefly. My name is Nabila Ramdani. I'm a journalist who was born in France to Algerian parents, and I've been working in journalism for the past 10 years or so. So I produce written journalism, but I also work as a broadcaster for television and indeed radio programs. You can feel free to ask me more questions about my background in journalism later on when I open this discussion to all of you. I'm hugely excited to be talking today, to be given the opportunity to talk about how to become a high quality journalist. And my workshop will actually present what I call the nuts and bolts of writing a great article that is informative, fact-based, legally safe, and ready for publication. So my workshop intends to explain the basics of journalism, hopefully in a manner that it's entertaining, but also interesting, and based on my wide-ranging experience, of course. My only regret today is that we're not all together in person and we're not meeting up properly, but with luck, we'll all be getting back to normal meetings before long, and I'll have the pleasure of meeting you, inshallah. I'm particularly thrilled to be speaking to a group of young Muslims. I am very proud of my Muslim background, and it's in fact one of the reasons why I got into journalism in the first place. When I was at school, I became very aware of how few Muslim journalists there were and how issues that are important to us were being ignored. And I wanted to do my bit to change all that. I use the word passionate because journalism is not a job to me, it's a way of life. I don't find it repetitive, I don't find it a chore, ever. In fact, I think it's highly stimulating, it's massively interesting, and it actually gives me a chance to influence people. I sometimes have to work at very odd hours, including evenings and weekends, and holidays are often interrupted. But to me, this is all part of the attraction of a job that is utterly engaging. In short, I'm one of those journalists who view what I do as a vocation. It's something I actually love and would encourage those who really love being a journalist to pursue a career in journalism. And that doesn't mean that you simply want to interview the Prime Minister or Stormzy, but it means that you potentially want to work at antisocial hours and put yourself in dangerous situations and potentially annoy people too. The key to any kind of journalism is communication. And my number one advice to any of you is to practice your communication skills every day. Whether you're writing a news story or a feature or a TV or radio script, you need to answer a few basic questions, which are normally who, what, where, when, and this one is normally the hardest, why. So digging out information is crucial, but great expression is very important too. And if I might offer you a very simple bit of advice for you now is to keep a diary. For example, produce 250 words about your life in a file every day. You could be writing about something that's incredibly boring, although I'm absolutely certain that many interesting things happen to you as well. But if you learn to express yourself fluently, that will be a skill that comes in useful whatever you do, but especially in journalism. Learning to express yourself in stylish, clear, unambiguous prose is often all about practice. Again, practice your communication skills and everything else will flow from that. In other practical terms, I would say to you that be prepared to work as a journalist for very little financial rewards to begin with, join in organizations and offer your enthusiasm and hard work. I started off, for example, working for the BBC in Paris, and I not only learned a lot about the profession, but I also learned how to make mistakes. I personally didn't study journalism at university, but there are some very good courses around. And I would actually advise you to study for a degree in history, in science, in English, languages, the law, and then perhaps do a postgraduate diploma in journalism, or else join an in-house training scheme. Now, you would have noticed that the era of social media, 24-hour news channels and cameras everywhere, has changed journalism massively over the past 10 years. There was a time when journalists controlled the flow of information, but not so much now. And the value we do add, however, is professionalism. We make sure facts are correct, we make sure our words are legal, and we make sure everybody can understand them. All high quality work needs to be underpinned by indisputable, proven facts, and that should underpin everything you do as a journalist. Sadly, technical developments have also made it very easy to create an alternative reality, one in which fake news is embraced by all kinds of people, from heads of states and politicians to anonymous trolls. And the contrast between fake news and quality journalism has never been more important, and it is essential that we all know the difference. And this is not just for journalistic reasons. I know some of you will go on to become brilliant journalists, but others will become politicians, lawyers, business people, teachers, and join a host of other professions and trades which can and will be affected by corrupt communication. Communication is absolutely essential to everything we do. If you can speak and write well, then you will be in a huge advantage, whatever career you choose. Honest communication is under attack like never before, and it is our job as journalists to fight back. Corrupt journalism is part of a much wider challenge to the value and credibility of all information. That is to say, facts about society upon which we should be making our decisions. If politicians, economists, social reformers, and a host of other influential people are lying, then what hope have we got of maintaining a civilized, democratic society? Of course, anybody is allowed to comment on the news and to try and fit into their agenda. And this has happened since human communication began. What is crucial, however, is that this opinion is based on facts, and that readers or listeners can have a reasonable opportunity to verify those facts. Thus, I would argue that the sudden emergence of fake news as a serious issue is in many ways a very good thing. It shows that people are aware of how easy it can be to check facts and how the old ways of simply alluding to something being true is no longer acceptable. In my own work as a working journalist, I have seen massive changes in the last 5 years alone. All the journalists I work with say that they often only took notes when they interviewed people. If there was an issue about what happened or what was said, then it was the word of the journalist and their shorthand note against the words of the witnesses. Nowadays, we can all take a picture instantly with our iPhones and indeed produce a video. This sounds incredibly simple, but the effect on day-to-day journalism, and indeed all forms of journalism, has been absolutely enormous. Just look at the way a politician can make a ridiculous claim and then be exposed by a video taken by someone he didn't even know he was filming him. Look at the way we are all under scrutiny like never before. It is almost impossible to do anything in public nowadays without being filmed at some point, whether knowingly or not. The joy of this is that mainstream quality journalism has the opportunity to show that it has value based on expertise, ethics, engagement, and experience. It is a wake-up call to be more transparent, relevant, and to produce better journalism. Beyond creating unquestionable evidence for the facts proper journalists produce, technology has allowed everybody the chance to judge and comment on what journalists produce. Again, when I speak to all the journalists, they say that letters of complaints would arrive occasionally, but generally they could be ignored. Nowadays, if there's something we don't like in the media, we can complain instantly through comment sections or even directly to the journalists concerned through Twitter or Facebook, for example. I think about this all the time when I'm producing my work and know that I cannot get away with anything that is not underpinned by solid facts. More generally, another of the positive effects that fake news debates have had is to provoke action. We can see broadcast networks and publishing outlets taking action to separate advertising from fake accounts. And we see a boom in fact-checking. Now, beyond being far more accountable, we can be far more human as journalists. We can show empathy and be constructive. We can change society for the better. Despite what cynical people say, this is actually what many journalists want to do. Our new transparency means we can display our sources if we want, but this doesn't mean that they all have to be named. Far from it. The best journalism is often based on anonymous sources, and the worst thing you can do as a journalist is to betray your sources. But if necessary, you can easily accompany your work with source material, such as a video or an on-the-record interview, even if the identity of the source is disguised. We also have to make sure that our work is the best there is every time. We can no longer just throw a story into a newspaper, knowing it will be a fish and chip wrapper in a few hours, and that hardly anybody will read it. Nowadays, we know that somebody in New York could be reading our work in a week's time, or even 2 years' time. Our work can become important at any time. It is a permanent record and no longer just a disposable commodity. Let me expand on that. In a word, well, to conclude, in fact, and we can expand on that in our discussion, truth based on fact-checking, balance, and accuracy is actually easier than ever. And that's a hugely optimistic side to the development of journalism nowadays. Thank you for listening so far. I'll end my little contribution there, and I would welcome questions from you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. If you had any questions, you can raise your hand or you can put it into the chat section and we'll get over to that question. So we have a question from Nosheen. How far lie is involved in journalism? How far? Nosheen, did you want to raise your hand and you can ask that question? Okay. Mohammed Amin, you had a question?
Mm-hmm. Shall I reply to Nosheen?
We'll just go over to Mohammed Amin first.
Sure.
Where do you source your information?
Well, it depends on the stories you're working on. To give you an example, I've actually been doing some work this morning only on a crime investigation in the south of France. It involved a couple, and a husband murdered his wife. Now he denies having murdered her. It's a pretty grim story. So how do you, get information, on the background of all this? For example, you can speak to the neighbors. They might have heard some commotion, some noise, some arguing leading up to the fight and indeed the murder. You can speak to the emergency services who turned up on the crime scene to discover a dead body and to speak to the alleged suspects. You can also speak to the police who are investigating the case and get more details about what is supposed to have happened. You can also get in touch with the prosecutor investigating the case, who might give you some details about, you know, what are the leads so far, what has the suspect said, and what, the witnesses could be.
Yeah.
Even though prosecutors tend not to say much once an investigation is open. In this case, you know, it's pretty safe to name all your sources. It gives credibility to the story. But, you know, for example, say the neighbors don't want to be named. Of course, you can protect their anonymity and just, allude to them. But it will give, you know, the story a lot more credibility as to how you got the information.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So should we go over to Nosheen's question, which I think is alluding to truth and falsehood in journalism?
Yes. Well, as I have been hinting in my talk, truth is more important than ever in journalism, because it's the foundation of civilization. It's what societies rely upon: honest facts, honest communication. That's what democracies are based on. You know, if people start lying right, left and center, who to believe? But we do have systems in place in advanced, regulated, civilized democracies to as safeguards. We have, for example, laws to protect us from, lying. To also, we have regulations within the industry of journalism. We of course have ethics to follow. If we're caught lying, it could be hugely damaging for careers and indeed in the wider picture, because it can harm people that are involved in our lives. It can change their lives for the worst. So we do have safeguards in place, but it has to be said that fake news and interference from cyber security attacks, foreign governments intervening in domestic politics are all a very real threat. For example, I interviewed the current head of state of France, President Emmanuel Macron, on the eve of him being elected. And there was a big news story breaking up then, and he shared it with me, which was the threat of Russian cyber attacks, threatening to meddle and interfere with the French election. So this could have changed the course of the result and indeed the course of France, as far as, you know, who becomes president is concerned and what policies are in place. So it's a huge challenge for the industry, but I think for societies as a whole.
Thank you, Nabila, and thank you, Nosheen, for that question. We have a question from Zara, and she's asking, what is the strangest story that you've ever had?
Strangest? Well, I've interviewed all sorts of people, including power players, heads of state, celebrities, including footballers, singers, but also more modest people, refugees in camps in the Middle East. So that's not strange. That's actually, you know, a very human side of journalism. Perhaps the strangest story in a fascinating way was for me to interview Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, who has now been murdered a few years ago, and his son, Saif al-Islam, who's still alive. And it was incredible, to hear I mean, it was a career-defining moment for me to meet such powerful people and such a powerful and at the same time hated dictator of Libya. And he revealed extraordinary links between Britain and his country of Libya, very covert, secretive links that involve business deals, security, including terrorism. And considering that Gaddafi himself had been involved in terrorism in the past, that was quite, an interesting interview. So I think, that was a bit strange to speak to somebody who's as fascinating and as hated at the same time.
Thank you for that. Riyadh is asking, how were you found by journalism companies, by the BBC? So basically asking a bit about how your career started. And you mentioned you started working with BBC in France. So how did that happen for you, and what sort of tips could you offer to our attendees today?
Well, I started off, actually my background was in academia. I used to teach British history and literature, British and American history and literature in Paris to undergraduate students. And I also was teaching French at Oxford University. And my career as a journalist started off at the BBC Paris Bureau. And I was an intern there. So I was in charge of a lot of things like basic stuff to begin with. Booking interviewees, making sure they get to the studio on time to give interviews, making sure the logistics of putting them on air were all well executed, but also working on editing, packaging, that is to say, putting videos together to create a little story, a little narrative, but also gradually working as a journalist myself, i.e. telling the story myself. So when I left the BBC as an intern, I started working for them as a freelance journalist. So they would call me in to talk about issues I was passionate about and I knew quite a deal about. And that is to say, issues related to Muslims in France, and the incredible sense of discrimination and they're facing when it comes to all aspects of their lives, from education and job opportunities to their faith as well. And I started off with the 2007 presidential elections in France. And I was contacted by a number of English newspapers to work on the coverage of the election that involved covering campaigns of the contestants and indeed securing interviews with them. And I have to say that I found the British media far more vibrant and dynamic and interesting, and indeed far more egalitarian than the French ones.
Thank you, Nabila. We have a question here from Aliyah, and she asks, do you ever receive any hate mail for your work? And I want to combine that with a question from Numa, who's asking, what is the best part of being a journalist?
Well, let's start with the positive. The best part of being a journalist is the incredible lifestyle and indeed life experience you get by covering all sorts of stories. As I said in my presentation, I don't consider journalism to be an ordinary job at all. It's something you have to commit to. So it means, working, at odds with, the usual 9 to 5 shift, for example. That's not how journalism works. You have to pace yourself according to the rhythm of developing new stories. So you can, I could be out going for a run, and then I receive a call from an editor, and I say, asking me, oh, can you look at this? This story just broke in France. Can you, send us, file us a copy about that and find out what's going on? And so I would interrupt my run and come back to my office, which often is home or traveling on location, and work on stories. Sometimes it involves meeting the people involved, or just putting phone calls and make sure that everything is well sourced and indeed the information is verified. So that's an exciting aspect, because you get to meet all sorts of people, ranging from powerful politicians. For example, I was able to meet David Cameron before he became Prime Minister, and before Brexit even happened, when the world seemed so simple then, and reasonable idea about where Britain was going were bandied around. There was no idea of a bombshell about Brexit Britain, or indeed, news that Donald Trump would become president of the US. And it's interviewing people of that caliber, always about matters that interest me, that are the focus of my journalism. So that would involve asking him about Muslims in Britain compared to Muslims in France, for example, and the opportunities that are offered to them. And I think the most positive aspect is, in fact, that in reality, when you meet people in the flesh, they tend to be pretty good, and that's why journalism is so fantastic. I think the other question was about hate mail, isn't it? Mm-hmm. You do receive that kind of sinister messages for all sorts of reasons. People who disagree with you, whether they have a valid reason to disagree with you or not. Some people, sadly, will just hate you because of who you are. A woman, a Muslim, a journalist, and for that reason alone, that would provide them ground for hatred and for sending those messages. That's unfortunate. I have to say, I don't get too many of them. But you can act on that. For example, if such hate comments appear on a thread on a news website where your story has been published, of course, you can ask the editors of the paper to remove those comments according to the law and ethics that govern journalism. Opinions are, of course, allowed and welcome, however strong they are, but there's a massive difference between hate and an opinion. And that's where the law and ethics do intervene. If you have a bit of common sense as well, you shouldn't be sending that kind of messages. But instead, I would, I always welcome people to share their point of view, to argue, the other side of the story, as they might call it, and have a rational exchange. But as I was saying earlier, an opinion has to be underpinned by solid facts. You can't create an opinion based on thin air, or if it's based on fantasy or pure speculation and something that doesn't exist, then I'm afraid you don't have the basis or the grounds for a proper discussion. It just becomes a bit fantastical, frankly. And I don't see the point of exchanging with people who are not genuinely interested in the exchange of ideas, but who are just there to propagate hate and similar feelings.
So Nabila, Hannah is asking, how long do you have, or how long are you given to write an article?
Well, that's a very tricky question, because I I mean, things have changed over time since I've been working in the industry. And, you know, a few years ago, you could, for example, I do write a lot of opinion comments, comment pieces. So you would, for example, approach an editor at a newspaper. You would pitch an idea and an argument around a comment piece you'd like to write. They might get back to you and say, we're interested, can you write that many words, usually between 700 and 900 words. And you could be given a couple of days, 3 days to write a comment piece. And that used to be the same for a news story. Sometimes you would approach a desk, a news desk, and they would ask you to work on a news story for, say, a week. But nowadays, the pace of journalism is so fast. It's almost, you know, writing a blog, which is very concerning because you do need time, you know, to check your information. And that's what makes any form of journalism, whether it's writing news stories or opinion pieces, you know, very solid and grounded in reality and facts. So that can be a bit challenging because you have to, you know, make sure you take all the precautionary measures to guarantee that your copy is legally safe and it's fact checked. Nowadays, I can be contacted by a news desk to write an opinion in the morning. I can be contacted at 9 o'clock and be asked to file my opinion piece by 2 p.m., 3 p.m., which is extraordinarily fast. And you do worry about not only concentrating on the argument, the message you would like to put across, what is my point? Because you do have to have a strong opinion if you are to write opinion pieces, but also to make sure that every single thing you put in your article is fact checked. So that's incredibly fast, you know, the pace at which journalists are asked to work at nowadays. And more than that, sometimes I'm even asked to produce, say I'm asked to work on a news story, to produce a video that goes with it, or a picture. And it can be incredibly tricky to secure all that within such a limited period of time. But I think the important thing is to pace yourself, to make sure that before you file, your story or your opinion piece, you know, is watertight. And I would suggest that, you know, you work at your own pace and within reason, you know, try to meet those deadlines. But if it puts your journalism at stake, I wouldn't rush to get your name on a story or to get your name on an opinion piece. What is far more important is your credibility as a journalist and your ability to produce, you know, journalism that is legally safe, that is factually checked, and that has a reasonable point to make.
So Nabila, a lot of the attendees here today, I'm sure, are very excited to take part in the competition. We have a question here from Mohammed Amin, who is asking, what are some of the tools that you would need to become a journalist? So what are some of the practical steps perhaps that you could share with the writers today that can help them with their entry?
Sure. So I didn't go down the usual route of being a journalist. Well, actually, that's questionable because a lot of journalists from an older generation, they just became journalists by practicing journalism. Very often they have dropped out of school age 16 and just wanted to become journalists and joined a newspaper or a training scheme, and they were sent, to cover stories. And it can be any kind of stories. But I think the primary thing to bear in mind is to become a high quality journalist is to have a broad knowledge, or indeed become a specialist in something. And for that, you need to have a solid degree in something, in my view, such as history, law, sciences, languages. But you always have to follow a legal training. because that's very, very crucial to avoid all sorts of trouble, including defamation. If you write something about someone that is not true, it can have an impact on their lives for the worst, including them committing suicide, for example, or taking their own lives, and all sorts of sinister things like that. So you have to think really hard about making your journalism legally safe. But I would suggest, becoming good at writing, becoming good at expressing yourself, at communicating. This is the key, really, to become a good journalist. I often say that to become a good communicator, you have to be able to explain something that's incredibly difficult in very simple terms, so as to reach as wide an audience as possible. If you use complicated jargon, big words, big technical phrases, then you're losing most of your audience and you're not making yourself understood to the wider public. So keep it simple, but it doesn't mean that it's not high quality. Simple communication is not simplicity. You can communicate highly sophisticated messages in very simple terms that many people would understand. And that's the key of being a very good journalist. I would encourage you to keep a diary and to practice, writing, say 250 words a day about, what you've been up to on the day, or something you remember. It can be anything, but it just needs, the practice of getting words on paper and, try to express yourself in a stylish way, because gathering information is, of course, crucial for journalism, but expressing that information in a stylish way is just as important. And this is a skill that you will need whatever you go on doing. But do a solid degree, join a journalistic course, a postgraduate course, join a training scheme, get some hands-on experience, be prepared to be enthusiastic and work for pretty much nothing at the beginning, as I did when I was at the BBC. I was an intern, I wasn't being paid for it. But all that hard work eventually paid off. And then, of course, you should be rewarded for your experiences and the hard work you put in. So that would be my basic advice.
Thank you, Nabila. Amira would like to know, what form of journalism are you most passionate for?
I am very passionate about politics, and because it affects our lives in so many ways. You can be a journalist who specializes in the arts, for example, culture, sports, economics, financial journalism. In the end, whatever your specialty is, there's always a political angle to any story. And that has always been my passion, because it means that you can hold the rich and powerful to account, and that is the key to a transparent, democratic society. I went into journalism because I was passionate about having voices like mine take part in the discussion about people like me, people who came from the same background as me, who were women or men from an ethnic background, from a religious background, but who you didn't see much on your television screens, who you wouldn't see their bylines, i.e. their names in newspapers, either doing stories or writing opinion pieces. You wouldn't hear them much on the radio. And yet, they were discussed in their absence. So I would often hear reports, for example, in the French media about people who, like myself, grew up on a housing estate outside Paris to an immigrant, a Muslim family, and yet the story would be told by a middle-aged white journalist who has nothing to do with people like me, who probably hasn't even set foot on those housing estates. And it annoyed me intensely. And dare I say, it did anger me. And I did realize that, you know, it's your duty to take part in that kind of discussions, you know, either as a journalist, or now we have many opportunities to join in those debates in any capacity. And I feel it's almost a responsibility to speak from our lived experiences, so as not to be robbed of, you know, the discourse around, you know, surrounding people like us, and so we can project, you know, our experiences in a more honest and in a more accurate and in a more informed manner. I found that most of the time, the reports I was hearing, the reports I was reading, were vastly inaccurate, full of omissions, discrepancies that bear no reality, no link with reality whatsoever, and often full of lies. And I think it's a responsibility as a citizen to get involved in these kind of discussions and speak for ourselves. It's an important thing to do, and I think journalism places you. It puts you in a position when you can not only project this honest, informed, reporting, but ultimately you have a great power to influence a society for the better.
What were some of the challenges that you might have faced, or that someone might face entering the journalism industry, and what advice would you give to newcomers? And that's a question from Amira.
So I faced an awful lot of challenges when I tried to become a journalist in my home country in France. After my experience as an intern at the BBC, I did apply to a lot of newspapers, French newspapers, and indeed other media organizations to join as a journalist. But my Islamic sounding name, the fact that I was of immigrant background, that my parents, of course, immigrant, that I was of a Muslim, all those aspects seemed to be a hindrance to become a journalist in France. I also didn't attend a school of journalism. I didn't, you know, pursue any postgraduate courses in a journalist, or even trained as a journalist. And then I moved to the UK and London, and I started to approach editors quite randomly, frankly, just looking at their websites and finding out who's in charge of the news desk and who's in charge of the opinion section. And I would just send an introductory email saying, I'm Nabila Ramdani, I'm a French-Algerian journalist. I can offer you this, that, and the other. And then I would get very, you know, I speak Arabic, I speak French, I speak English. I'm interested in covering these kinds of issues. And I would always get very positive replies. And I was never asked to produce a CV, for example, or to justify my academic credentials. If anything, I would say my editors were not interested in my academic background at all. But it was more of a can-do approach, like, what can I offer? What can I do for them? And straight away, I started getting commissions to write opinion pieces about the experience of Muslims in France, of debates about the headscarf, about halal food, about Muslims in sports, or just broadly about the politics of France. You know, explain what the president was up to, why people were on the streets demonstrating, what were the strikes about, what were the demonstrations about. And just by producing copy after copy, I started to broadcast journalism. called in TV studios as a commentator, but also doing radio pieces as well. And that's how I built up my reputation as a journalist. So it really is practicing and keep doing it. But that was my experience. So I have to say that I found that the British media, as far as I'm concerned, were far more, it was a far more attractive industry because I wasn't being judged on who I was, but on what I had to offer.
Riyadh would like to know, once you've collected your information, what precautions do you take to make sure that it is accurate?
So you can take, all sorts of precautions, and you pretty much have to verify everything. For example, say you write about a story about a minister. Like, for example, a few days ago, I was writing an opinion piece about a junior minister in a new cabinet reshuffle in France. And I was aware of her previous position. And of course, you have to check what her new position is. So you have to look up all those facts. I mean, it might sound, innocuous, she's a minister, who cares about the little differences? But in fact, if you get her title wrong, then people might think, well, what else did she get wrong in her copy? So it doesn't matter how small or big the mistake is, you don't want to have any mistakes in your copy. It can be checking all sorts of things, the age of people you're referring to in your copy. But of course, there are bigger mistakes that you can make. For example, if you accuse someone of doing something that they didn't do, then that can lead to a lot of legal headaches for you and your newspaper. So always, for example, I was discussing a crime story before, check the facts with the police, with the prosecutor, with witnesses, always do some checks on the suspects themselves. For example, you might, and don't rely on copies of colleagues, because you can be reading, an article that has been written by a colleague saying, so-and-so is a French national. And then you look it up, it's like, oh, actually, this guy is not a French national, but he's been living in France for a long period of time. So, as I said, they are all, there's a gradation in the kind of mistakes you can make, but however small or big, it doesn't look good on the journalist. And dare I say, it can end up your career instantly. Some people have been, just have seen their careers ended because of a tweet, or because of a story that they, in which they put an awful a lot of allegations that could be, for example, racist or discriminatory. There was not so long ago a journalist from a British newspaper who went to France. I won't discuss the specifics, but he went to France to cover, communities living in housing estates, and his copy was just full of, prejudice about those communities. He would insert elements that he presented as facts, but in fact were not. And those were this was easily verifiable information, because he would lie about the place, he would lie about their activities, and most of the information now you can find online. So it's much easier nowadays to verify information than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, let alone decades ago. For example, in the past, journalists would be given 1 week, 2 weeks, up to a month to go to the archives the National Archives at Kew, for example, and queue up to get hold of a file and then labor on it for weeks on to get to the crux of the information needed. Now you can access all those informations online. You can literally access the archives and find the information you're looking for within minutes. So it's very important to check everything you put in a copy. And even more so that you have the resources to do so in quite a short period of time.
Thank you, Nabila. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today in terms of questions, but the questions have been coming in. There have been so many questions. So thank you everyone who's attended this session, for asking your questions and for driving this session. And also thank you, Nabila. So Nabila,
thank you very much for having me. I really enjoy this.
So thank you, Nabila, for sharing your experience as a journalist and for your advice on how young writers can also take the steps to becoming a journalist. And I'm sure, like myself, the young journalists that we have here today have been inspired by your work and your career. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all the participants. I really enjoyed the questions.
Absolutely. I also wanted to thank all the attendees who have joined us here today. I hope you have been equipped with the passion and the drive to explore journalism as a possible career path for yourself. And I hope you also take the opportunity to try writing an article and try entering it into our competition as well. So Nabila mentioned the question, so the details at the beginning, but just to reiterate, the competition, the Young Muslim Writers Awards, is currently open, and it will be closing on the 13th of August, so just under a month away. If you are aged 5 to 11, you can enter the short story and the poetry categories. And if you're aged 11 to 16, then you have the poetry, short story, journalism, screenplay, and play script categories open for you. So just under a month, but that's plenty of time to try writing an article or any of the other forms into the competition. So we're just going to sign off from here, but once again, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Nabila, for joining us as well.
You're most welcome.
Thank you very much.